Good morning, everyone. It is really great to be here. I wish this was a packed room like some of the others I've been to where I've been sitting on the floor, because it's such an important discussion that we have here. My name is Liz Willen. I'm editor-in-chief of the nonprofit Hechinger Report, a news outlet, and we've been closely following this upcoming Supreme Court decision that we're expecting in June and anticipating enormous consequences for higher education, for college admissions, and for the future of a diverse workplace. More than 40 years of legal precedent are at stake, as is the ways that race and ethnicity are considered in college admissions. And there's going to be a Supreme Court ruling on two cases, Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and Students for Fair Admissions versus University of North Carolina. We're not going to get deep into the legal issues today, but we are going to first start by showing a short clip of a film that my team at the Hechinger Report helped produce with Retro Report and WCNY Radio. And then we're going to be hearing from two lawyers, a recent law school graduate, Michael Wang, who is going to be featured in the film, and a doctoral student, don't ask him how long it's going to be, Erick Ramirez Manriquez, and Natasha Warikoo, right here, who is the author of several books on race and college admissions, Gail Heriot, raise your hand, Gail, a professor of law at the University of San Diego and a member of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and to my left, Anurima, director of Anthem of Us, a strategic advisory and consulting firm, and she's an attorney who led federal civil rights enforcement and policy in schools and higher education, and the U.S. Department of Justice. So right now, we're going to see the clip of this film, which is a great introduction to our discussion and to what we can expect in June. Hit it.
Harvard systematically raises the bar for Asian Americans and systematically lowers it for whites, African Americans, and Hispanics. We allege that Harvard has a quota.
That possibility has long worried some in the Asian American community, but it was one student's fight that made it front page news, attracting Bloom to the cause.
Michael Wang did everything he could to get into Harvard.
Which actually sang at Obama's inauguration. Multiple speech and debate awards, piano competitions.
But in 2013, the California high school student was rejected by his dream school, even as he says students with lower grades got in.
I spent middle school, high school really grinding away, taking as many AP classes as I could, participating in as many extracurriculars as humanly possible, really just trying to put together the best resume for these Ivy Leagues and all these top-tier institutions. Ultimately, when I got my decisions, they weren't what I expected. So I wrote to their admissions offices by email and I asked them, can you tell me how you utilize race as a factor of admission? All I wanted to see was, is me being Asian American something that disadvantaged me in my application? The answers I received back from those admissions offices were unsatisfactory. And so that's where, in 2013, I decided to file my 3 complaints, and that's how I got started on this whole road.
While the U.S. Department of Education ultimately decided not to act on Michael Wang's complaints, in 2014, Bloom began to seek out Asian American students to bring a lawsuit.
The lawsuit against Harvard University for discriminating against Asian American applicants just took a new twist, with claims that the bias against them is a, quote, personal thing, including such traits as positive personality, likability, and attractive to be with.
You cannot remedy past discrimination with new discrimination.
Bloom's case has deeply divided the Asian American community.
We are united today to protect opportunity. Bloom's lawsuit is racist in its effort to whitewash history.
We're still a minority at the end of the day. Asians have been discriminated against. I would hope that as a minority, as an Asian American, we're not the ones losing out.
Thank you. Michael, how many years ago was that?
So this video was taken last year, but I did start on this journey back in 2013, which is actually 10 years ago. It's been a while.
And now that you've been on this journey, and we're looking at the Supreme Court coming up with a decision in June, what do you think about what's at stake here?
Well, there's definitely a lot at stake with not only college admissions. This goes much more, this goes much more beyond college admissions. It really goes into play as to how do we, how do we judge people, right? If race is being used in college admissions, how is it being used? Is it being used to positively benefit a student's application, or is it used to negatively, affect a student's application? There's a lot of underlying implications that come to this.
We're going to have others give a little bit more of their own talk about what's at stake, but I'm curious if you now see from where you were then to what the Supreme Court is possibly going to do in June. How do you feel about that?
It's I'm scared and interested to see what happens at the same time. We're currently dealing with the Supreme Court, a conservative bloc that we haven't seen in a while. What the court may come out with a decision, I don't know. We've seen a lot of things being overturned in these last years, so I'll be interested to see what happens next.
Natasha, there's a lot at stake here. How do you see it? And after watching Michael's and listening to his case.
Yeah, I just want to clarify one thing before I talk about what I think is at stake that I think is really important given the clip that we saw, which is that I want to make sure that there's a separation between two issues. One is there discrimination towards Asian Americans, which is illegal, in college admissions, I should say. Obviously, there's discrimination towards Asian Americans in many other domains. And then the second is, should we have affirmative action? Now, what Bloom has tried to do is to connect these two issues that are totally different. I will say, I won't get into the weeds of this, but I used to think there's something weird going on, but when the data came out from this case, it became pretty clear that discrimination is not what is driving those differences in test scores and academic achievement, right? That there are other factors, it's holistic admissions that are driving these differences. So whites benefit over all students of color from things like legacy admissions, athletic recruiting, wanting someone from every state, all of these other things, and that's what the data tells us. So there's no racial discrimination policy. Now, we could debate whether we think those things are good or bad, but that's not what this case is about. So I just wanted to clarify that. In terms of what's at stake with affirmative action, because this case is not about Asian Americans, it's about affirmative action. And there are two cases in the Supreme Court. One is the one against Harvard, which is purporting to be for Asian Americans, although there was never any named plaintiff. No Asian Americans testified in that case. And then the other one is at UNC, which is on behalf of whites applying to UNC. There is a lot at stake, and I don't want to be overly, I'm not the dramatic type, I'm an academic, but I'm going to say that it is a threat to democracy is at stake. And let me say why. We know there are 9 states now that have bans on affirmative action. We know what has happened in those states. California, I know you're going to talk about this, has not practiced affirmative action since 1998. And the data from those states suggest continued declines in the percentage of Black, Latinx, and Native American students. And there's a precipitous decline the year after it ends. We're going to see that in a year if this happens in court, which is likely. And then we make small gains, right? So then the university pivots and says, oh, okay, well, let's recruit a little bit more in predominantly minority neighborhoods. Let's, have a diversity essay. Let's maybe go SAT optional to try to get those numbers back up. But the reality is that none of these places have been able to get back to the underrepresented minority numbers absent affirmative action. We've seen, and that leads to when we have those students going to lower status colleges, they become less likely to graduate, right? So this idea that they're kind of out of their league is wrong. The data suggests they're actually less likely to graduate because they're going to colleges that have lower graduation rates. Right. We see, there was a study of medical school, and then, when you don't have that pipeline in undergraduate, you also can't practice affirmative action in graduate school. We see fewer underrepresented minorities in medical school, law school, graduate school. We know from the research on healthcare, African Americans already suffer from inadequate healthcare and differential care compared to whites with the same doctor. Same race doctors can help that. That is good. Medical health care is going to decline. We're going to see declines in leadership. And, Sandra Day O'Connor in the 2003 case talked about, you need to have a leadership that is legitimate in the eyes of the people, right? And if you don't have diversity in that leadership, people are not going to take it seriously. Like if there's no one who looks like me in the leadership, I'm not going to, believe or take in good faith what they're saying or doing. And, we're going to see that. And she felt...
we're going to come back to you.
Sorry, okay.
Okay. Because I'd like Erick, who actually did grow up in a state without affirmative action. It was banned, I believe, when you were 4 years old.
Yeah.
And has now, in studying many of these issues, has really come to think about what that meant for your life and your opportunities. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about how you see what's at stake.
Yeah, so definitely. One of the things that I think relates to a lot of things that you're mentioning right now is the effects of 25 years of not having a.
I'm going to ask you to eat the mic.
Oh yeah, 25 years of not having a affirmative action in the state of California. I think for me in particular is really growing up. Really not thinking about opportunities that have, prestigious occupations, for example, or PhDs in that matter.
And where did you start college?
Yeah, I started in community college too. So one of the things that come into mind in relationship to what you're mentioning is the racialized tracking that occurs in K-12. And so I was tracked in remedial courses and attended community college for that matter. One of the things that happens when you attend some of these institutions too is the fact that you don't see a lot of representation in terms of faculty of color having PhDs or thinking about yourself as having an opportunity outside of less selective institutions. And that's definitely something that happened to when I was growing up, is thinking about myself as not someone who could attend or apply or think about myself at a selective institution, whether being private or public institutions. And so one of the things that happened in the state of California was that funneling effect, where after the ban here in the state, we saw Latinx and Black students being funneled to less selective institutions, community colleges, for-profit institutions, right, and less selective institutions across the board. And that also applies to the labor market. And so in my work in particular is the effect, the socializing effect that happens out of that. The lack of representation in leadership positions, the lack of representation in prestigious occupations, and that really does solidify, there's a lot of research that says when students of color don't really interact with faculty of color, don't have a lot of diversity, you're become excluded out of that process itself. And I think that's definitely what's at stake for me, is that over the course of 25 years, 50 years, or 60 years from now, if it gets banned on a national level, we're definitely going to see this almost like racial hierarchy occurring even more, where Latino and Black students will be underrepresented across the board in prestigious occupation and prestigious institutions, which has been the case for 25 years in the state of California. So I just wanted to mention that. And just the last thing about this whole thing too is that think about what makes historically marginalized in education institutions and social institutions, right? We intend that to be Latinx and Black students in a social historical process. There's an opportunity for us to really change that and for it not to be linked only for Latinx and Black students. And I think that's the opportunity that can present itself. It could exacerbate it or also be a good outcome out of it. So.
Thank you so much. And Gail, I saw you shaking your head, so let's hear you respond to some of the things you just heard.
Okay, I'm going to have to talk a lot slower, but nevertheless, I hope a lot more accurately.
But you have to eat your mic, though.
Eat it? Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, first of all, the notion that this is not about discrimination against Asian Americans, yes, it is. It is about discrimination against Asian Americans. It's also about discrimination against whites. You can't preference someone into a class without preferencing someone out. And so that is the bottom line on that. There was also a statement that Proposition 209 in California and similar initiatives in other states that have banned preferential treatment based on race or sex or ethnicity, that somehow that is a threat to democracy. That is democracy. That's what the initiative process is all about. It is democracy. But let me go back to what I think is probably a more important issue right now, and that is the pedagogical. Race preferences, there's a growing body of research showing that they simply don't work, that we're trying to give minority students a leg up by relaxing academic standards for them, but we've actually made things worse. We would have more African-American scientists, engineers, doctors, dentists, probably more African-American lawyers and college professors generally, if we had stuck to the principle of race neutrality in admissions instead of relaxing academic standards.
Yeah, I just need to step in here.
No, I'm afraid not, because I'm just absolutely shocked by what you've said. And there are studies by UCLA law professor and sociologist sociologist Rick Sander, Dartmouth professor Rogers Elliott, James Davis at the University of Chicago, Peter Arcidiacono, a Duke economist. All of them are finding the same thing, that we would have more African American professionals if we did not engage in race preferences. There are studies that suggest otherwise, but the weight of authority now is going towards the mismatch side of it. And here's the kicker here. That if students went to the school where their academic credentials actually match what the rest of the students are like, they do better. It is uncontroversial that they would get much better grades. The part that people disagree on is whether or not they would go on to better careers. And I think the weight of the evidence now suggests that yes, indeed, they would go on to better careers. And that's significant. It means that over the last 50 years, we have been shooting ourselves in the foot over this issue. On the legal issue, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act is very clear. It says, no person shall on the ground of race, color, or national origin be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. That is clear and unequivocal language. Yet courts have somehow tied themselves in knots to get around it. It is about time that we start applying the law the way the law is actually written rather than the way that judges wish it were read.
Okay,
the rule of law is a precious thing, and I will get to the constitutional issue when I have an opportunity.
When you have another opportunity, because I'd like to have Anurima give us a chance to respond to some of the things that you said.
So I'm gonna actually start where Erick ended. And I'll get into the accuracy conversation, which I think is really a problematic one. So let's just talk about what America is like today, right? Our schools across the country are as segregated as they were in 1970. And so when we talk about issues of what that means, first of all, the ways in which we have much of our education system works is actually a huge problem for so many kids who don't have access to the kind of opportunities that they need to be able to even have a fair chance at being able to be admitted to colleges and universities around the country. And let's be clear, because I want everyone to hear this, when we're talking about holistic admissions processes, we're only talking about 5% of higher education institutions. And so we're having this conversation about this one particular moment in time as if people are entitled to something in that process that doesn't account for the fact that so much of the way in which our education systems are set up is privileging some to the detriment of many others. And so we can talk about tracking, we can talk about school discipline, we can talk about the ways in which kids have opportunities for after school, for all the kind of extracurricular programs that so many kids just don't have a chance to have. And so we're not giving people a fair chance to begin with. And so I think it's ludicrous to talk about the idea of some people getting preferences in a process when the entire system has been set up to preference those who have money, those who have access, and those who have privilege, right? So let's just start there. The second part of this is, where are we in America? We're at a point where we are extraordinarily divided. We're divided by hate, we're divided by violence, and what we're actually talking about here is what it means for us to have a chance to be in spaces together, where we actually encounter people who might look different from us, which means that when a 16-year-old boy comes to your door, you don't shoot them in the head because you're afraid because you've never encountered someone who might have looked like him, right? That's what we're talking about here. And if we're talking about a situation in which the real thing that is going on here, and let me be very, very clear, it's a horrifying moment when you're sitting in the Supreme Court of the United States, as I was, and you look up and you have people saying that they are sitting here trying to advocate for Asian American students, and you're looking at 6 white male lawyers, and there's not an Asian American kid to be found, right? It tells you a little bit about what the actual project is. The actual project is a divide and conquer project. It is a project of realizing that we're about to get to a place in this country where non-whites are a majority of who's in America, and that is who America is. And the fear of that is something that is creating a situation in which people are trying to do everything they can to cut off the ability of some people to be able to access opportunity in America. That's what's going on. And the fact that it didn't work when they brought cases based with white students, it didn't work multiple times, means like, let's go find Asian students. And let me tell you, in June, one of the things that's going to happen here is no matter what the decisions say, the blame will go to Asian American students. And at a time when we are talking about anti-Asian violence, at a time when we're talking about what it means to not have your worth as a human based on your test scores and your SATs, you see all over this conference, right? There are conversations about what's the ways in which we understand our value and our worth. And what does it mean to actually create a situation in which our creativity, ChatGPT is a better way in which to be creative. We can talk about all this stuff, right? But if our worth is just being narrowed in the way that these kinds of cases are trying to narrow it, and we're in a situation in which we're in divide and conquer, that is a project that has nothing to do with education. Education is just a tool to get us there, right? And so I think we have to think really carefully about what it is that's actually at stake here, which is in America, the people are trying to divide, where there's a lot of fear going into this. There's a lot of fear-mongering in these cases about of one community against another, right? And at the end of the day, you have a bunch of people who have a lot of money, who are largely white, who are walking away unscathed, right?
If you didn't follow the Varsity Blues scandal, then you know exactly what we're talking about. It was hard to ignore that one.
So I'll stop there. I'm
Yeah,
not going
because-
to talk about any part of the legal, because
Yeah, we're not going to do that.
We're not
going
to
to do that here.
But
We're really talking about what's at stake for the future, and I think that was a terrific look at that. And I think it's up to Michael now, because you were a high school student when that clip that we just saw of you in the film. You were really thinking differently about how you didn't get into certain colleges. Did you anticipate this moment where we are right now, and do you have any regrets about that? Because listening to what Anurima said and thinking more now that you're a lawyer about what's at stake here, would you do something differently now? Did you understand that the reckoning that we could be faced in now, we could face?
So I think there's been a lot of important issues brought in that. One, the main issues I do want to highlight that I think we can all agree here is that this is not just, affirmative action is just not a simple issue as its own. It's an education issue as a whole. We've brought up many times, not everyone's starting off at the same foot, right? So if we don't start at the same start line, we have to use affirmative action to try and get people to the same place. But affirmative action in its whole, it's a band-aid solution to a cancer known as systemic racism in our society, right? We have bigger issues here to solve, but affirmative action is only a surface level issue. Now, as an Asian American, I brought this, I filed complaints, and I decided to pursue this route, not because for my own personal benefit. If you asked me if I would choose Harvard or Williams, I'd choose Williams still in a heartbeat, though, my alma mater. But the issue is, Asian Americans are still being discriminated against. Now, let's say affirmative action gets overturned. What happens there? That's what I'm scared about, because I don't know. How do we still achieve diversity in our institutions if we don't have affirmative action? But what this does is if affirmative action does get abolished, which could be possible, this opens conversations new as to, first, what is diversity? Second, how do we actually achieve diversity without using quotas? We're not allowed to use quotas.
Nobody is using quotas. Please be accurate in what you're saying. Nobody is using quotas. That is not something that has been the case in America for 40 years.
Sure.
Stop.
Sure, but is it still a zero-sum game? For someone to lose, someone has to lose.
You're making it into a zero-sum game, but it's not a zero-sum game.
So can Harvard accept a limited number of students?
Of course it does. Every university has a limited number of seats.
Exactly. So
of course that's true.
how do we manage to achieve diversity now?
So can I just step in here?
She's written several books on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think this question of Asian Americans is a really important one. I think if we care about anti-Asian discrimination, there is a lot of anti-Asian hate going on right now. People are being attacked, brutally attacked in public. Let me be clear. So if Edward Bloom and his associates cared about anti-Asian discrimination, he would be addressing that. He would be addressing Asian American kids have the highest rate of bullying in school. He would be addressing that. You know, East Asians in particular experience bamboo ceilings in the workforce, have a hard time getting into the C-suite. If he cared about anti-Asian discrimination, he would go after that. He is not. Now, let me just explain what's happening with admissions. It's holistic. These universities say it's holistic. Whether you think that's fair or not is a different issue, but these universities can do what they want in terms of how they admit students. And so they are looking, like I said, when you look at the data, there is no quota. It's clear. It's about, you know, all of these other things that the universities are looking at that seem to privilege whites over all people of color, including Asian Americans, including Black, including Latinx applicants. Now, you can argue that, well, they shouldn't be taking one person from every state. They shouldn't be looking at whether you intend to major in the humanities, because guess who wants to major in the humanities? It's mostly white kids. And they shouldn't be looking at legs. You can argue that, but that is not what is at stake in this case. That is not going to change if affirmative action ends next month. And so this is what is driving that Asian Americans seem to need higher academic credentials. It is not, because that is not how they are admitting students. Again, that is not discrimination. That is what these universities are doing. You can argue about that. That is not at stake at the law. You cannot sue because of that, because there's no class-based, anti-class-based discrimination in the law. Can I just say one more thing, Liz, about mismatch? Because I think this is really important to be accurate, as Anurima said. There is plenty of research, and yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know what research you're quoting. I'm a social scientist, I'm a sociologist, and I read the data very carefully. There's a big study out of University of California. University of California has not practiced affirmative action in a quarter century. There's an economist, a sociologist who has looked at applicants to the UC system before and after the ban. And he finds that actually this idea of mismatch is very intuitive, right? You're going to a place where you don't have the academic credentials and you can't cope and you're going to drop out. But it's actually the opposite, that those applicants they go to lower status colleges. We forget that the college, where you go to college matters, right? If you're going to a place that has a higher graduation rate, it's like a rising tide lifts all boats. You're more likely to graduate. Your college has more resources, and they are more likely to graduate. Because they're going to lower states, they're less likely after the ban to go into STEM fields. And down the line, Latinx wages seem to decline by 5% of those who applied. And so this idea, and if affirmative action was kind of bigger, right? Meaning that they accepted students with a much lower academic preparation than the rest of their peers, perhaps we would see that. The data suggests we do not see that. And I'm sorry, Gail,
absolutely not.
I
mean, I don't know where you spout these things from,
Gail,
but we've actually got data on this, and it's
Gail,
quite important.
Gail,
the study on the University of California by Duke economist professor, rather than the student paper that you are talking about,
Oh, no,
showed
actually,
that
let's talk about all of the
209
IVs
did
that
the
you're so
opposite.
worried about. Those are the people doing these data, and the mismatch theory has been debunked, Gail. We did this conversation in 2006 and 2007, and what you're essentially saying, which is extraordinarily condescending, is that if we just had a bunch of students who went to segregated schools, they do better.
It's segregated schools.
Yes,
to go to the school where your academic credentials match. Are you saying that minority students have credentials that are so low they're below all white students? I mean, that's absurd. That is absurd.
Could I add something?
I'm going to let Erick, who actually has been a student where they banned affirmative action, talk about his own experience.
One of the things that comes into mind in these conversations is the fact that there's this piece of there's race neutrality, right? We live in according to some of the points that mentioned from both of you, is that we can bring this point of race neutrality, but there's no such thing as race neutrality. Educational institutions have been segregated, been affected by these ideas of race itself. And so to me, what comes into mind when discussing this is the fact that race already shapes a lot of what we're doing in education institutions and jobs itself. And so even the literature points out, when you don't take race into account, actually it reaffirms the ideas, or even it doesn't really challenge the status quo itself. And that's what is potentially at stake here, is the fact that if you don't consider race in this process itself, you're going to continue to do the same outcomes that we've been doing, and we're seeing the same outcomes that we've been seeing. And so I think it's really important to kind of point that out, is that race already continues to shape. And so what happens when you pick people that, or focus on the racial effects that happens to Latino and Black students? And I think a lot of times what happens is that we have those people who benefit from it question that process itself. And I think that's exactly what's happening right now, is that there's a lot of questioning of what happens when I lose my status in power, but that's not the reality here. The reality is that we're trying to really make an equitable equitable opportunity to provide for those students that, again, have been quote unquote historically marginalized. I think that's exactly what's at stake here, is the fact that since whatever time, since 1960 or 1963, we've continued to see all of this. And so I think that it is really time to change what it means to be historically marginalized, and this is an opportunity to be able to do that.
Michael.
If we're going to talk about historical marginalization, we do have to admit that Asian Americans have been discriminated against in the past as well. But the whole issue is, we should be looking at race. But the courts themselves have even stated in Grutter versus Bollinger that you can't use race as a negative factor. You can use it as a positive factor. So right now we have the situation here, right? With affirmative action, people, including Asian Americans, are questioning whether or not race is being used negatively. Now, if we get rid of affirmative action...
Sorry, there's no evidence that it's being used negatively towards Asian Americans or whites.
The data...
You're right, it's zero sum.
That's not even the argument being made, Michael. There's no evidence of that.
Why is there no evidence? There's so much data on it.
There's no data.
What's the data that you're talking about?
Okay.
One at a time.
When I filed the complaint, there wasn't that much data on it, right? Because the whole college admissions process.
I just explained the data, Michael. I'm sorry, but test scores are not how they make decisions.
This is a fantasy land if you think there's no discrimination.
If that was the case, why did I file my original complaints? Why did I, as a college student back in 2013, I read on online forums, why did I have the notion that I had to achieve 2,400 SATs, 36 ACTs, perfect GPA and everything in order for me to have a better chance in college? Where'd that notion come from?
I don't
Was
know.
it just a stereotype? Why did every single Asian American student applying to college have that single notion that we had to achieve higher? Where did that come from?
There's this book
I'm going to stay in order. Anurima, please.
So Michael, I think this is actually really one of the really sad, unfortunate parts of it, right? I'm Asian American, and part of what we hear, unfortunately, is that the ways in which we think about our worth, right, are things like test scores and grades. And that's exactly what we're trying to do something differently about, which is the way that we should look at students when they're coming into colleges and universities is on a range of factors, right? And one of the important factors in that is that the result of what might come out of these cases is that we can look at everything but someone's racial and ethnic background, which for me and for you and for many others is an important part of who we are, right? And so part of what I think we have to get to is, yes, it's unfortunate. And part of what we're seeing in colleges around the country is a move away from the idea that the ways in which we measure people are test scores. That's why we have the move away from U.S. News and World Report. We have the move away from SATs. We have the move away from a whole bunch of testing regimes because we do want to think differently about who we want to be our leaders. That's not based on these kinds of numbers. It's unfortunate. It's unfortunate, right? And I know you do. It's unfortunate that the message that has gone out is a suggestion that if someone has those numbers, that they deserve, right, to be in school over those who might have different kinds of numbers. In part because of, you and I both know that there's a lot baked into why it is that some people do well on tests. A lot of it has to do with test prep, which a lot of people can't afford, right? There's a lot of things baked into that. So when we're talking about what we want in terms of how we look at our children and how we look at our future, we want a chance for children to be able to celebrate and be worthy of all of who they are. And that includes the histories, the traditions, the ancestries, the fact that we can go back 100 years to the Supreme Court this year, right? And there were cases about whether Asian Americans were white for the purposes of being American, right? Mm-hmm. And we're here 100 years later still having these conversations about how do we prove that, right? And I want us to get out of that conversation, not about how we prove that, our worth, but about the fact that we are worthy because of all of the things that we are.
Yeah, and Natasha, in one of your books, you talk a lot about different ways that we might rethink college admissions as, regardless of what happens in this case.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, the reality is a place like Harvard, does not have space to take every single valedictorian in this country. So just wrap your head around that. Every single valedictorian, they will not accept.
Or perfect SAT
Or perfect SAT scores. There are too many people with perfect SAT scores, perfect GPA.
No matter what race they are.
No matter what race they are. So we have to get away from this. And then we got to go back to, what is the point here? What are we trying to accomplish as a university? Go back to our mission. What is our purpose? And when you read the mission statement of most colleges, there's something in there about it focuses on contributing to society, creating the leaders for tomorrow. Sometimes they talk about social mobility. Of course, teaching and research, that's what the faculty do, but admissions can and should play a role in that. Colleges need to think, what are we trying to do here? How do we contribute to the leadership of tomorrow? That leadership has got to be diverse. It's got to be, we've got to get students who are going to, come back to their community and contribute to that community, address issues. They understand the issues in their community. They can, start an AI platform or an ed tech company to serve those communities, probably with a better understanding than someone who has grown up in a different kind of place. So this is what is at stake. And if we focus on that mission and how do we make our society better using college admissions, and of course it's one little policy. So absolutely, Michael, we need more educational equity. We need a better social support system. We need a stronger,
and Gail, do you have a problem with that?
Are you me?
Yes, I'm asking.
I have a huge problem with this whole panel. There's been more misinformation on this panel than any panel I've ever been in my entire life.
Actually, wasn't my question.
Right now, hold on.
You're doing pretty well then, Gail.
Hold on. The Supreme Court of the United States is about to decide 2 cases. And a lot of people are very concerned that they will ban race preferences. And yet I'm told here that there is no discrimination. If that's the case, why is anybody worried about the Supreme Court decision? They're obviously worried because there is a whole lot of race discrimination going on in schools today. And we're told, well, rich whites. Well, there are a lot of poor whites too. I think many people who have objections to race preferences, including me, have far less objection to preferences based on actual, socioeconomic class. You have to be very careful there as well because you can create the same mismatch case where students are actually not benefiting from going to school where their academic credentials are greater or less than where the typical student's credentials are greater than the student who's getting preferential treatment. And by the way, mismatch is not just a problem for minority students. It's also a problem for legacy students, for athletes. We have a long history of taking in students whose academic credentials do not put them in the ballpark with other students, do not make them competitive. And we all know that over the years, over the decades now, there's been a problem with athletes not getting the benefit of their education because they are mismatched. And this is a problem all around. If we ignore the problem, we are never going to correct the issues that are before us today. You have to look carefully at the fact that academic credentials for African American students, on average, there are plenty of exceptions, they're not doing as well as Asian American students. And that's just a fact. How do we correct
Anurima
that?
has,
For example, you'll find if you look at polls about how often people study, Asian American students study a lot more. We've got to correct that, bring that level up for all students.
Gail, I'm going to stop you. I'm going to stop you because when you sit there and make typical associations about certain groups and race, it's just condescending and demeaning and not true.
But true.
But let me just say the things that we agree on. Let me just say the things we agree on, Gail. Because I want to just. I entirely agree with you, right? That part of the discrimination, and there is a lot of discrimination by race and other things in schools, right? We just disagree on where that falls, right? But I would also agree with you on is that the opportunities that young people have by class is marked and significant. And I hope that part of the conversation we have is how do we create higher education systems that allow those kids, I don't care what race they are, who are in communities where they are striving, they are doing everything they can to try to have a better life for themselves, have a chance to do that. But I want it to be that kids of all racial backgrounds also have that chance. And what we know is that the ways in which a lot of our systems are set up, kids who are black and brown have a bunch of things stacked against them, right? And so So that's an important.
That was one of the great things about Proposition 209. Right after it passed here in California, people for the first time in years were taking seriously the question of how are we going to make K through 12 schools better.
But that's not the reason why for it. And I just want to.
That was the reason why for it.
Absolutely. I want to turn it to Erick to close this out. But
yeah, we have very little time left, and Michael.
I want to say one thing, which is the purpose here of these cases before the Supreme Court is to suggest that something like a diverse community isn't something that is important and valuable, and that race should not be a part of the conversations we're having. And that is the part that's really dangerous. Erick, I'm turning it over to you because we have like 45 seconds to go.
Yeah, so the last thing I think that, just tying it back to some of the conversations that we were having, is who's actually being mismatched, right? I think that's really the question. And what is the outcome of mismatch itself? Well, you'll see that Black and Latino students become located in lower prestigious occupations, make less.
Yes,
money.
we've seen that over and over again.
Over and over again.
Duke University economists found that as a result of Proposition
I think
209, the number of African American students who had STEM degrees went up, GPAs went up, graduation rates went up. As a result,
Erick the last word. Erick.
Thank you. So I just think it's really important to question who does not benefit from this and who does it affect the most, and actually who also benefits the most out of this whole process. And it's very clear that it's not historically marginalized students.
That's great. Michael, did you want to wrap up real quickly?
Final word. Regardless whether or not we agree or disagree, I think one thing we agree on is our education system needs help. We really do need it. Regardless whether or not we're helping people at the college level with affirmative action, or we're fixing our education system as a whole at the start. Our education system has problems. Affirmative action is just one thing in our whole education system being brought up. But there's a lot of work on equality and race we need to work on. Regardless of where we start, we have issues we need to fix. I hope that's one thing you guys can take away from this panel today.
Thank you. We were hoping we would have time for questions. We do not, but I think that the panelists may... I'm sorry, but thank you. I know it's a divisive issue. I urge you to continue following it, and some of us will stick around and you can ask.